The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Yorkshire like a gray blanket, and Thomas Hartwell stepped out of his stone cottage with a steaming cup of tea in hand. At 62, he had seen enough dawns to know this one felt different. The air carried an odd metallic taste, and his border collie, Pepper, refused to leave the porch, whining softly as she pressed against his legs. Thomas had inherited the farm from his father, just as his father had from his grandfather before him. 500 acres of good English soil, dotted with sheep, and divided by ancient stone walls that had stood since before anyone could remember. It was honest work, simple work, and Thomas preferred it that way. The world beyond his valley could keep its complications. He was halfway to the barn when he saw the crater. Where yesterday there had been his best pasture, now there was a smoking hole nearly 50 feet across. The grass around its edges was blackened and twisted, and the air above it shimmered with heat. Thomas set down his tea with hands that only trembled slightly. In his decades on this earth, he had seen German bombs fall during the war, watched meteors streak across night skies, and weathered storms that seemed to tear at the very foundations of the world. But this was something else entirely. As he approached the crater's edge, he heard it, a sound that made his spine straighten and every instinct scream at him to run. It was a low, rumbling whimper, like the earth itself was in pain. Thomas had heard wounded animals before, trapped sheep, injured dogs, even a deer caught in wire. But this sound seemed to vibrate in his bones, carrying a weight of intelligence and desperation that made his heart race. At the bottom of the crater, coiled in a heap of what looked like liquid metal and flesh, was a dragon. Thomas blinked hard, wondering if the morning light was playing tricks on his old eyes. But no, there it was. The creature was massive, easily the size of his prize bull, with scales that shifted between deep purple and black like oil on water. Its wings, torn and bleeding, were stretched wide as if it had tried to break its fall. One wing hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. The dragon's long neck curved gracefully even in its pain, ending in a head that was both terrifying and beautiful. Golden eyes, each larger than Thomas's fist, stared up at him with an intelligence that made him take an involuntary step backward. The dragon's breathing was labored, each exhale sending small puffs of steam into the cool morning air. Along its flanks, Thomas could see deep gashes that wept something that looked like liquid starlight. The creature was clearly dying, and just as clearly aware of its fate. Those golden eyes tracked Thomas's movement as he circled the crater. There was no aggression in them, no threat. Only a bone-deep exhaustion, and something that looked remarkably like resignation. The dragon watched him the way a man might watch a doctor approaching with bad news, hopeful but expecting nothing. Thomas had spent his life caring for animals. He could recognize pain when he saw it, regardless of the species. And right now, he was looking at a creature in more agony than anything should have to endure. The dragon made another sound, softer this time. It was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the distance between them with perfect clarity. To Thomas's amazement, it almost sounded like words, like a language he didn't understand but somehow felt in his chest. "Easy there," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the surreal situation. "Easy, lad." At the sound of his voice, the dragon's head lifted slightly. Those massive eyes focused on him with startling intensity, and for a moment, Thomas felt as if he was being measured, evaluated, judged by an intelligence older and deeper than anything he had ever encountered. Then, the dragon did something that would stay with Thomas for the rest of his life. It closed its eyes and lowered its head in what could only be described as submission. The gesture was unmistakable, universal across species. It was the same way Pepper looked when she had been caught stealing food from the kitchen counter. The same way a sheep looked when they were cornered and had nowhere left to run. It was surrender. Thomas stood at the edge of that crater for a long time, his practical farmer's mind warring with something deeper, something more fundamental. Everything he knew about the world said this was impossible. Dragons were creatures of myth and legend, not bleeding, broken things that fell from the sky into his pasture. Everything he had been taught about safety and survival said he should call the authorities, back away, protect himself and his property. But everything he believed about right and wrong said something else entirely. The dragon's breathing was growing weaker. Whatever forces had brought it to his farm, whatever cosmic accident or design had placed this moment in his hands, Thomas knew he was looking at a choice that would define him, not as a farmer or an Englishman or even a human being, but as something more basic than all of those things. He was looking at a suffering creature that needed help. The walk back to his cottage felt like miles, though it was only a few hundred yards. His mind raced as he gathered supplies, clean sheets from the linen closet, his largest cooking pot, bottled water, antiseptic from the medicine cabinet, and the emergency medical kit he kept for treating injured sheep. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. When he returned to the crater, the dragon hadn't moved. Its eyes tracked him as he carefully climbed down into the hole, but it made no threatening gestures. If anything, it seemed to shrink away slightly, as if trying to make itself smaller, less threatening. Right then, Thomas said, setting down his supplies, "Let's have a look at you." The dragon's wounds were worse up close. The gashes along its sides went deep, revealing layers of muscle and something that pulsed with its own inner light. The broken wing was clearly causing immense pain, bent at an angle that made Thomas wince in sympathy. And there was something else, something that took him a moment to recognize. The dragon was starving. Thomas had seen enough malnourished animals to recognize the signs. The way the scales seemed loose on the creature's frame, the hollow look around those golden eyes, the weakness in its movements. This wasn't just an injured dragon. This was a creature that had been struggling to survive for far longer than its current injuries would suggest. As he worked, cleaning the worst of the wounds with water and antiseptic, the dragon remained perfectly still. It watched him with unblinking attention, but never moved, never protested, even when Thomas's ministrations must have caused additional pain. The only sign of its discomfort was an occasional soft rumble deep in its throat, a sound that somehow conveyed gratitude alongside the pain. The sun was high overhead by the time Thomas finished what he could. He had cleaned and bandaged the worst wounds, fashioned a crude splint for the broken wing using fence posts and canvas, and given the creature every drop of water he had brought. It wasn't much, certainly not enough to save a creature this badly injured, but it was a start. As he climbed out of the crater, Thomas caught the dragon, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was intelligence there, deep and ancient, but also something else, something that looked like hope. That evening, Thomas sat in his kitchen with a cold cup of tea and tried to process what had happened. By all rights, he should have been terrified. He should have called the military or scientists or someone with more authority and expertise than a simple farmer. Instead, he found himself planning. The dragon was too large to move, too injured to leave. If it was going to survive, it would need food, medical attention, and time to heal. Thomas had no idea what dragons ate, or how to properly treat wounds that seemed to bleed liquid light, or even if the creature would survive the night. But he knew he was going to try. That night, Thomas made 3 trips to the crater. The first was with every blanket he could spare, carefully arranged to provide some insulation against the cold. The second was with a lamb that had died that morning. Natural causes, thankfully, wondering if dragons were carnivorous. The third was simply to check on his patient. Each time, those golden eyes tracked his movement. Each time, the dragon remained perfectly still, perfectly calm, as if it understood that this strange, small creature was trying to help. On his final visit, as Thomas arranged the last of the blankets, the dragon did something extraordinary. It spoke. The words were in no language Thomas had ever heard, but somehow he understood them anyway. They seemed to bypass his ears entirely, resonating directly in his mind with a clarity that was both startling and oddly comforting. "Thank you." That was all. Just those 2 words, spoken with a weight of meaning that made Thomas's eyes water. He stood there in the dark, looking down at this impossible creature that had somehow learned to trust him, and felt something shift in his understanding of the world. "You're welcome, lad," he whispered back. "Sleep well." As Thomas walked back to his cottage, he didn't notice the small, dark shapes moving across the night sky far above. He didn't see them pause, hover, and then streak away toward the horizon. And he certainly didn't know that halfway across the galaxy, in the command center of a warship larger than his entire county, an alarm had just begun to sound. The dragon had been found, and with it, the first human to show kindness to one of the galaxy's most feared predators. What happened next would change everything. 3 days passed before the strangers arrived. Thomas had settled into a routine of caring for his unexpected patient. Each morning, he would check the dragon's wounds, change the makeshift bandages, and bring fresh water. The creature, who had somehow conveyed that his name was Vorthak, was healing with remarkable speed. The gashes along his flanks had sealed themselves, leaving only faint silver lines, and the broken wing was already showing signs of proper alignment. More importantly, Vorthak was eating. It turned out that dragons were indeed carnivorous, but with appetites far more reasonable than the legend suggested. A sheep every few days seemed sufficient, though Thomas suspected the creature was being deliberately modest in its needs. There was something almost apologetic in the way Vorthak accepted food, as if he understood the sacrifice each meal represented to a simple farmer. On the third morning, as Thomas was refilling the water containers, Vorthak's head suddenly snapped upward, golden eyes scanning the cloudy sky with unmistakable alarm. A low growl rumbled in the dragon's throat, and for the first time since his arrival, Thomas saw the predator that lurked beneath the wounded creature's grateful exterior. "What is it, lad?" Thomas asked, following the dragon's gaze upward. The answer came in the form of 3 dark shapes descending from the clouds. They moved with the impossible smoothness of things not bound by normal physics, shifting from distant specks to clearly artificial constructs in mere seconds. They were ships, Thomas realized, though unlike any aircraft he had ever seen. Each one was roughly triangular, made of what appeared to be polished black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They settled onto his fields with no sound whatsoever, their landing creating perfect circles of flattened grass. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but he forced himself to remain calm. Beside him, Vorthak had gone perfectly still, though Thomas could feel waves of tension radiating from the great creature. Whatever these newcomers represented, the dragon clearly considered them a threat. The ship's surfaces rippled like water, and figures began to emerge. They were humanoid, but only just tall and impossibly slender. They moved with a fluid grace that made Thomas think of dancers or predatory birds. Their skin was a pale blue-gray, stretched tight over angular bones, and their heads were dominated by large, dark eyes that seemed to hold no warmth whatsoever. They wore form-fitting suits of the same light-absorbing material as their ships, and each carried what was unmistakably a weapon of some kind. There were 9 of them in total, and they arranged themselves in a perfect semicircle around the crater. One of them, distinguished by additional markings on its suit, stepped forward and fixed its unsettling gaze on Thomas. When it spoke, its voice was like wind chimes made of ice. "Human," it said, and Thomas was somehow unsurprised that he could understand the words. "You will step away from the Draconis." Immediately, Thomas looked down at Vorthak, who was watching the proceedings with alert but resigned eyes. There was something in the dragon's expression that made Thomas's jaw set in a line his late wife would have recognized. It was the same look he got when the local council tried to tell him how to run his farm, or when developers came around talking about compulsory purchase orders. "I don't think so," Thomas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades dealing with stubborn livestock and bureaucrats. "This is my land, and he's my patient." The alien's head tilted in what might have been confusion or amusement. "Your patient? Human, you do not comprehend the situation. This creature is a Draconis mortalis, a deathbringer. It has raised worlds, consumed civilizations. It is one of the most dangerous entities in known space." Thomas glanced down at Vorthak again. The dragon met his eyes, and in that moment of connection, Thomas felt a rush of images and sensations that nearly dropped him to his knees. Flashes of memory borrowed from an alien mind. Vast starships burning in space, cities reduced to ash, the screams of the dying echoing across 1,000 different worlds. And through it all, the terrible hunger, the endless, gnawing emptiness that drove the Draconis to consume everything in their path. But there was something else in those shared memories, something the alien had not mentioned. Thomas saw Vorthak's own horror at what he had become, the desperate attempts to resist, the hunger, the isolation and self-loathing of a creature trapped by its own nature. He saw Vorthak fleeing from his own kind, choosing starvation over slaughter, until weakness and Desperation had sent him tumbling from the stars to land, broken and dying in an English farmer's field. "I see," Thomas said quietly, and Vorthak's eyes widened in surprise. No one had ever seen. No one had ever looked past the monster to find a person trapped inside. The lead alien stepped closer, its weapon now clearly visible in its hands. "Then you understand why it must be destroyed. The Draconis cannot be controlled, cannot be contained. Where one appears, death follows. It is the way of things." "Is it?" Thomas asked. "Because from where I stand, I see a creature that's been eating one sheep every few days and saying thank you when I bring him water. Doesn't sound much like a world-ending monster to me." A murmur ran through the group of aliens, and Thomas caught several of them exchanging glances. The lead alien's expression grew even colder. "You speak of things you do not understand, human. Your species is young, primitive. You lack the experience to recognize true danger when you see it. We are the Kethmori, guardians of the inner systems. For 10,000 years, we have protected civilized space from threats like this." "Step aside." Thomas felt something stir in his chest, a familiar stubborn heat that his wife used to call his Yorkshire rising. He'd felt it when his neighbors had tried to force him to sell his land to developers. He'd felt it when government inspectors had tried to shut down his farm over paperwork technicalities. And he felt it now, facing down 9 armed aliens who thought they could march onto his property and harm a creature under his protection. "No," he said simply. The alien's weapon came up, its barrel pointing directly at Thomas's chest. Around the crater, the others followed suit, creating a very clear demonstration of superior firepower. Thomas was outnumbered, outgunned, and facing beings whose technology was so far beyond his own that resistance should have been laughable. He stood his ground anyway. "You would risk your life for a monster that would devour you without hesitation?" the lead alien asked, genuine puzzlement coloring its voice. Thomas thought about that for a moment, looking down at Vorthak. The dragon was watching him with an expression of profound amazement, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. When their eyes met, Thomas felt another flash of connection, and this time it was his own memories that flowed between them. Images of his life on the farm, the quiet satisfaction of caring for his animals, the simple pleasure of watching lambs grow strong in green fields, the contentment of honest work, honestly done, and underlying it all, the fundamental belief that had guided every day of his 62 years. When something was suffering, you helped. It didn't matter if it was convenient, or safe, or profitable. You helped because that's what decent people did. "He's not a monster," Thomas said finally. "He's hungry and hurt and a long way from home. I've seen real monsters, lad, and they don't say thank you when you bring them water." The alien's weapon never wavered, but Thomas thought he saw something shift in those cold eyes. "You would die for this belief?" Thomas considered the question with the same careful attention he gave to all important decisions. Would he die for this? For the principle that every living thing deserved compassion? For the idea that kindness was more important than fear? "I suppose I would," he said, somewhat surprised to discover it was true. The silence that followed stretched for what felt like hours. Thomas could hear Vorthak's breathing behind him, slow and steady. He could smell the dampness in the air that promised rain later. He could feel the weight of 9 alien weapons trained on his chest. And then, impossibly, the lead alien lowered its weapon. "Fascinating," it said, and for the first time, there was something like emotion in its voice. "In 10,000 years, we have never encountered anything quite like this." Thomas felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, though he was careful not to show it. "What do you mean?" "The Draconis hunger is absolute," the alien explained, its weapon now hanging loosely at its side. "It consumes everything: reason, compassion, even self-preservation. We have studied them for millennia, hoping to find some way to break the cycle, to free them from their nature. Every attempt has failed. Every Draconis we have encountered has been lost to the hunger, reduced to nothing more than a living weapon of mass destruction." The alien paused, studying Vorthak with new interest. Yet this one chooses starvation over slaughter. This one accepts charity with gratitude. This one, it trailed off, seeming to struggle with concepts that didn't fit its understanding of the universe. "This one what?" Thomas prompted. "This one has somehow learned to hope." Behind him, Thomas heard Vorthak make a soft sound, something between a sigh and a sob. The dragon's massive head dropped to rest against the crater's edge, golden eyes closing as if the weight of the alien's words was too much to bear. The question, the lead alien continued, is what changed? What broke the pattern? What allowed this Draconis to resist what has consumed every member of its species for countless generations? Thomas looked back at Vorthak, remembering their first encounter. The dragon's surrender, its willingness to trust a complete stranger, its obvious gratitude for even the smallest kindness. Then, he looked at the assembled aliens, these self-proclaimed guardians who had spent 10,000 years dealing with the Draconis problem through violence and fear. Maybe, he said slowly, the answer isn't what changed about him. Maybe it's what changed about how he was treated. The alien's head tilted again, and Thomas could practically see the wheels turning behind those dark eyes. Explain. You said you've been hunting them for 10,000 years, always seeing them as monsters, always treating them as threats to be destroyed. Did it ever occur to you that maybe that's exactly what made them into monsters in the first place? The silence that followed was so profound that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat. Around the crater, the other aliens had lowered their weapons as well, all of them staring at Vorthak with expressions of dawning comprehension. You're suggesting, the lead alien said slowly, that the Draconis hunger is not innate but learned? That it's a response to persecution rather than an inherent trait? I'm suggesting, Thomas replied, that maybe when you treat someone like a monster for long enough, they start believing it themselves. And maybe when you treat them with kindness instead. He gestured toward Vorthak, who had opened his eyes and was watching the exchange with fascination. Maybe they remember how to be something else. The lead alien stood motionless for a long moment, then did something Thomas had not expected. It holstered its weapon and approached the crater's edge. When it spoke again, its voice carried a note of something that might have been wonder. Draconis, it said, addressing Vorthak directly, is this human's assessment accurate? Has kindness succeeded where force has failed? Vorthak's great head lifted, and when he spoke, his mental voice was clear enough for all present to hear. For the first time in 1,000 years, the dragon said, I remember what it feels like to be grateful instead of hungry, to hope instead of despair, to trust instead of fear. His golden eyes shifted to Thomas. This human saw a monster and chose to see a person instead. In doing so, he reminded me that the person was still there. The lead alien stepped back, and Thomas could see its worldview cracking apart in real time. 10,000 years of policy, of absolute certainties, suddenly called into question by a Yorkshire farmer and a starving dragon. This changes everything, it whispered, and in the distance, barely visible against the cloudy sky, more ships were beginning to appear. Word was spreading through the galaxy faster than light could travel. The Draconis that had been found was not behaving according to the patterns. The human protecting, it was demonstrating capabilities that existing models said were impossible. The universe was about to get a very different picture of what humanity was capable of. And it all started with an old farmer who believed that kindness was stronger than fear. / by the end of the week, Thomas Hartwell's small farm had become the most watched piece of real estate in the galaxy. What had started with 9 Kethmori ships had grown into a gathering unlike anything the galaxy had seen in recorded history. Ships from dozens of species crowded the skies above Yorkshire, their representatives establishing camps across Thomas's fields with a politeness that surprised him. The Zalari Confederation sent their most senior diplomats. The crystalline hives dispatched scholar drones. He described the slow corruption of his species, the way the gnawing emptiness had grown until it overwhelmed everything else. Most painfully, he told Thomas about the moment he'd realized what he had become, standing in the ruins of a city he'd destroyed, surrounded by the ashes of people who'd done him no harm. I tried to stop, Vorthak had explained during one of their morning conversations. For 50 years, I tried to resist the hunger, but it was always there, always growing stronger. Eventually, I convinced myself that resistance was futile, that I was simply a force of nature, like a storm or earthquake. It was easier to accept being a monster than to keep fighting to be a person. What changed? Thomas had asked, carefully cleaning the last of the healing wounds. You did, Vorthak had replied simply. You looked at me, truly looked, and saw someone worth saving. For the first time in centuries, I remembered that I was more than just appetite and destruction. These conversations had not gone unnoticed by their growing audience. Every species present had their own theories about what was happening, their own explanations for the unprecedented change in Draconis behavior. The Kethmori maintained detailed recordings of every interaction. The Zalari drafted complex psychological profiles. The crystalline hives calculated probability matrices with millions of variables. None of them could adequately explain how a simple farmer had accomplished what their combined civilizations had failed to achieve in millennia. It was Dr. Lyrian Voss, chief xenopsychologist for the Galactic Council, who finally requested a formal interview. Thomas found her waiting by his front gate one morning, a tall, elegant woman with the distinctive silver skin and luminous eyes of the Astral Collective. Unlike the other observers, she came alone and unarmed. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying the musical undertones of her species. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I'm Dr. Voss, and I've traveled quite far to speak with you." Thomas looked at her over the rim of his teacup. She was the first visitor who'd bothered to use his actual name rather than simply calling him the human, and he appreciated the courtesy. "Doctor," he acknowledged, "I suppose you want to know how I tamed the dragon, as they've been calling it?" Dr. Voss's expression grew troubled. "Actually, that's exactly the kind of thinking I'd like to discuss. The prevailing theory among my colleagues is that you've somehow used an unknown human ability to control or pacify Vorthak. They're calling for extensive testing, possibly even dissection of his neural pathways to understand the mechanism." Thomas set down his cup with a sharp clink. "Over my dead body." "That's precisely the response I was hoping for," Dr. Voss said with obvious relief. "You see, Mr. Hartwell, I don't think you've tamed anything. I think you've done something far more remarkable and far more simple. I think you've been kind." Thomas studied her face, noting the genuine interest there rather than the cold calculation he'd seen in many of the other observers. "And that's remarkable because kindness, true kindness, is perhaps the rarest quality in the galaxy," Dr. Voss replied. "Most species, once they achieve interstellar travel, become focused on efficiency, logic, survival. Emotions like compassion are seen as evolutionary holdovers, inefficient remnants of a more primitive time. The Kethmori eliminated them entirely through genetic modification 3,000 years ago. The Zalari suppressed them with neural implants. My own people view them as interesting but ultimately useless psychological artifacts." She paused, watching Thomas's expression. "But humans have maintained them. Not only maintained them, but elevated them to core values. You have a saying on Earth, treat others as you would like to be treated. Most species would consider that hopelessly naive. And what do you consider it?" Thomas asked. "Revolutionary," Dr. Voss said immediately. "Mr. Hartwell, in all our studies of the Draconis, we focused on their biology, their hunger, their destructive capabilities. We never once considered simply asking one of them what they wanted, what they needed, what they were feeling. We saw monsters to be studied or destroyed, not people to be helped." Thomas thought about that while he finished his tea. It seemed so obvious when she put it like that, so fundamental that he wondered how an entire galaxy of advanced civilizations had missed it. What Vorthak needed, he said slowly, wasn't to be fixed or cured or controlled. He needed to be reminded that he was worth saving. "Exactly," Dr. Voss breathed. "And somehow, your species maintained the ability to see that, to look past the surface and find the person underneath." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the crater. Thomas hurried over to find Vorthak surrounded by a crowd of agitated aliens, all talking at once in overlapping languages. At the center of the chaos was a figure Thomas hadn't seen before. Another dragon, but this one smaller and clearly female, with scales that shifted between deep red and gold. She was also clearly in the same condition Vorthak had been when he'd arrived, injured, starving, and desperate. "Her name is Thyra," Vorthak explained as Thomas approached. "She's been running from Kethmori hunters for 60 years. Her ship failed 2 systems over, and she's been trying to reach me ever since." The crowd of observers had fallen silent, all eyes fixed on this new arrival. Thomas could practically see the wheels turning in their heads. One reformed Draconis could be an anomaly, a fluke. Two suggested a pattern, a possibility that everything they thought they knew about the species was wrong. Thyra's golden eyes swept over the assembled crowd, lingering on the Kethmori representatives with obvious fear. When her gaze fell on Thomas, however, something changed. She had clearly been in communication with Vorthak, because recognition sparked in her expression. "You are the human," she said, her mental voice carrying both hope and disbelief. "The one who showed mercy to my kinsman." Thomas looked at this new arrival, seeing the same desperate hunger in her eyes that he'd recognized in Vorthak. But there was something else there too, something that hadn't been present in Vorthak when he'd first fallen from the sky. There was expectation, hope, the belief that kindness was possible. "I am," Thomas said simply. "And you're welcome here, lass. Let's get you looked after." The effect of those words on the assembled crowd was immediate and profound. Thomas heard gasps from a dozen different species, saw the Kethmori representatives step back in apparent shock. Dr. Voss was staring at him with an expression of pure wonder. "Just like that," she whispered. "Without question, without demands, without even knowing who she is or what she's done." Thomas was already climbing down into the crater, gathering supplies to tend to Thyra's wounds. "She's hurt and hungry and afraid," he said over his shoulder. "That's all I need to know." As he began cleaning Thyra's injuries with the same gentle efficiency he'd shown Vorthak, Thomas became aware that absolute silence had fallen over the gathering. Every being present was watching his every movement with an intensity that was almost physical. Later, Dr. Voss would describe what happened next as the moment the galaxy began to understand humanity. Thyra's wounds were infected, clearly the result of inadequate care over weeks or months of desperate flight. As Thomas worked, she began to speak, her mental voice growing stronger as the pain eased. "I destroyed the colony on Kepler, 442b, she said, the words carrying a weight of shame that made several observers step back. 7 million people. I was so hungry, and they seemed so small. I told myself they wouldn't miss a few cities." Thomas paused in his work, but only for a moment. "How long ago was that?" he asked quietly. 80 years, Thyra replied. "I've been running ever since. The hunger grew worse, but I couldn't bear the thought of doing it again. I've been slowly starving myself rather than feed." Around the crater, Thomas could feel the wave of shock rippling through the crowd. The destruction of Kepler, 442b, was one of the most infamous Draconis attacks in recent history, studied in military academies across the galaxy as an example of the species' absolute ruthlessness. Yet here was the perpetrator, consumed by guilt and remorse, choosing slow starvation over repeating her crimes. "That must have been very difficult," Thomas said, his tone carrying no judgment, only sympathy. Thyra's great head lifted to stare at him in amazement. "You don't hate me? Fear me? I am a mass murderer, a destroyer of worlds." Thomas considered that while he continued working on her wounds. Around them, representatives of species that had lost countless members to Draconis attacks waited for his response with barely concealed tension. "Were you born wanting to destroy things?" Thomas asked finally. "No, tidak guispeth. I was born wanting to create them. I was an architect once before the hunger. I designed living cities, places where art and nature existed in harmony. I wanted to build beautiful things that would last forever. And if the hunger wasn't driving you, what would you want now?" Thyra closed her eyes, and when she spoke again, her voice broke with suppressed emotion. "I want to fix what I broke. I want to build something beautiful again, something that makes up for all the ugliness I've created. But I know that's impossible. Some things can't be undone." "Maybe not," Thomas said, finishing the last bandage. "But that doesn't mean you can't try to do better going forward." The silence that followed was so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat. Then, impossibly, Thyra began to cry. Great, glowing tears rolled down her scaled cheeks as 80 years of suppressed grief finally found release. And in that moment, every being present understood that they weren't looking at monsters. They were looking at people. Broken, damaged people who had lost themselves to forces beyond their control, but people nonetheless. People who could feel regret, who could choose redemption, who could learn to hope again. Dr. Voss was the first to speak, her voice hushed with awe. "My God," she whispered, "what have we been doing?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. For millennia, the galaxy's response to the Draconis had been simple. Find them, kill them, move on. No one had ever thought to ask what they wanted, what they needed, what they were feeling behind the hunger and the rage. No one had ever thought to show them kindness. As word of the second Draconis' arrival spread through the gathered ships, Thomas noticed something interesting happening. The careful distances that the various species had maintained from each other were beginning to break down. Kethmori officers were talking quietly with Zalari diplomats. Crystalline scholars were comparing notes with Void Walker philosophers. The shared revelation was creating connections between species that had barely acknowledged each other's existence for centuries. That night, as Thomas made his rounds with dinner for his two patients, he found them deep in conversation with several of the alien observers. Not interrogation or study, but genuine conversation. Dr. Voss was asking Vorthak about Draconis art forms. A Kethmori scientist was listening with fascination as Thyra described the architectural principles of her homeworld. For the first time in anyone's memory, the galaxy was seeing the Draconis as something other than monsters to be feared. But in the darkness beyond the gathered ships, other eyes were watching. Eyes that belonged to beings who had built their power on the fear and hatred of the Draconis, who had profited from the endless cycle of violence and revenge. These watchers saw the changes happening on a small English farm, and they did not approve. The forces of hatred were mobilizing, and Thomas Hartwell's quiet revolution was about to face its greatest test. The attack came without warning on a Tuesday morning. Thomas had just finished his breakfast and was heading out to check on Vorthak and Thyra when the sky above his farm exploded into chaos. Massive warships materialized from hyperspace, their hulls scarred by decades of battle and painted with symbols he didn't recognize. These weren't the scientific vessels and diplomatic ships that had been peacefully observing for the past 2 weeks. These were instruments of war, and they had come with violent intent. The ships that opened fire weren't aiming for the dragons. They were targeting the gathered observers, the scientists and diplomats, and philosophers who had come to witness the Yorkshire phenomenon. Energy beams lanced down from orbit, turning peaceful research camps into smoking craters. The beautiful crystalline structures of the Hive scholars shattered under sustained bombardment. Kethmori vessels that had sat motionless for days suddenly erupted in flames. Thomas ran toward the crater where his patients sheltered, but before he could reach them, armored figures began materializing around his farm. They wore the black and crimson uniforms of what Dr. Voss had once mentioned in passing. The Purifier Coalition, extremists who believed that some species were too dangerous to be allowed to exist. The Coalition had built their entire ideology on the premise that the Draconis were irredeemable monsters. The events at Thomas's farm threatened that worldview so fundamentally that they had chosen to respond with overwhelming force rather than accept the possibility they might be wrong. "Stand away from the Deathbringers, human," commanded the Coalition leader, a massive figure whose multiple arms each held a different weapon. "You have been contaminated by their influence. We will cleanse you of their corruption after we complete our primary mission." Thomas positioned himself between the soldiers and the crater, his heart hammering but his voice steady. "They're under my protection. You'll have to go through me." The leader's laugh was like breaking glass. One primitive human against the combined might of the Purifier Coalition? "You cannot be serious." "He's not alone," said a voice from above. Dr. Voss dropped from the sky, her normally elegant form encased in gleaming combat armor that marked her as far more than just a xenopsychologist. Behind her came a dozen other figures, scientists and diplomats who had shed their academic facades to reveal the warriors underneath. But even their intervention might not have been enough against the Coalition's overwhelming numbers, if not for what happened next. Vorthak erupted from the crater. For the first time since his arrival, the dragon took to the air, his newly healed wings carrying him upward with a grace and power that sent Coalition soldiers scrambling for cover. But instead of attacking, Vorthak positioned himself directly above Thomas, his massive form casting a protective shadow over the farmer who had shown him kindness. "You want to kill me?" Vorthak's mental voice boomed across the battlefield, carrying to every mind present. "Then do it. But you will not harm the human who taught me to remember my own humanity." Thyra rose from the crater as well, her smaller form taking position beside Vorthak. "We will not run anymore," she declared. "We will not hide. If you insist on seeing us as monsters, then face us as the people we choose to be." The coalition forces hesitated, clearly unprepared for dragons who chose to protect rather than destroy. Their entire tactical doctrine was based on hunting creatures driven by mindless hunger, not beings capable of strategic thinking and moral choice. Thomas looked up at his patients, his friends, and felt a surge of pride that nearly overwhelmed him. In that moment, he understood what they were offering. They were giving him the same gift he had given them, the choice to be more than what the universe expected. The battle that followed would be remembered in galactic history as the Yorkshire Stand. It was not a large engagement by the standards of interstellar warfare, but its significance far exceeded its size. For the first time, humans, dragons, and dozens of other species fought side by side against those who would perpetuate hatred and fear. Thomas himself never fired a shot. Instead, he did something far more dangerous to the Coalition's cause. He continued being kind. When a wounded Coalition soldier fell near the crater, Thomas dragged him to safety and tended his wounds, ignoring the weapons still trained on him. When Thyra hesitated before attacking a group of enemies, clearly fighting her old instincts, Thomas called out encouragement. "You choose who you are, lass. Don't let them choose for you." Most remarkably, when the Coalition leader himself was injured and abandoned by his fleeing troops, it was Vorthak who carried him to safety, the dragon's gentle care of his former enemy, creating an image that would be broadcast across the galaxy within hours. The fighting lasted less than an hour, but its aftermath would shape interstellar politics for generations. The Coalition's forces were either destroyed or captured, their brutal ideology exposed for the universe to see. More importantly, the response to their attack demonstrated something unprecedented, genuine cooperation between species that had barely trusted each other days before. As medical teams worked to treat the wounded, Thomas found himself sitting on his porch with Dr. Voss, both of them too emotionally drained to speak. Around them, the smoking ruins of what had been a peaceful gathering served as a stark reminder of how quickly understanding could turn to violence. "They'll be back," Dr. Voss said quietly. The Coalition wasn't the only group with an investment in keeping the Draconis as enemies. There are weapons manufacturers, military contractors, entire planetary governments whose power depends on maintaining fear and hatred. Thomas nodded, unsurprised. He'd seen enough of human nature to know that some people would always choose hatred over understanding if it served their purposes. "What do you think will happen now?" he asked. Dr. Voss was quiet for a long moment, watching as Vorthak helped coordinate the evacuation of wounded Coalition soldiers. "I think," she said finally, "that you've started something that can't be stopped. Not by the Coalition, not by anyone who profits from hatred. You've shown the galaxy what's possible when we choose compassion over fear." As if to prove her point, a new ship appeared in the sky above them. But this one didn't descend with weapons ready or diplomatic protocols engaged. Instead, it simply hovered, broadcasting a simple message on all frequencies. "This is Captain Xeris of the Independent Freighter Dawn's Promise. I carry 17 Draconis refugees who heard about what's happening here. They're not asking for sanctuary or protection. They're asking for a chance to help." Thomas stood up, feeling a smile spread across his weathered face. "Well," he said to Dr. Voss, "I suppose we'd better put the kettle on." The ship settled gently in his largest field, and its passengers began to emerge. They were Draconis of all ages and sizes, each one carrying the same look of desperate hope that Thomas had first seen in Vorthak's eyes. But there was something more there now, something that hadn't existed before his farm became the center of a galactic revolution. There was expectation. These dragons weren't arriving as refugees fleeing persecution. They were arriving as volunteers, ready to help build something new, ready to prove that their species could be more than the monsters history had painted them as. Among the passengers was an ancient Draconis whose scales were more silver than any other color, clearly one of the eldest of his species. He approached Thomas with the careful dignity of age and wisdom, but there was nothing condescending in his manner. "I am Elder Corthan," he said, his mental voice carrying the weight of centuries. "I have lived for 3,000 years, and in all that time, I have seen nothing but fear and hatred directed at my kind. Yet here, on this small world, in this simple place, you have accomplished what all our scholars and philosophers deemed impossible." The ancient dragon lowered his massive head in a gesture of profound respect. "You have reminded us that we are people, not forces of nature, that we can choose who we become, regardless of what we have been. On behalf of my entire species, I offer you our eternal gratitude and our pledge. Never again will a Draconis choose destruction over creation, hunger over compassion, hatred over hope." Thomas looked around at the gathering crowd, dragons and aliens, soldiers and scientists, former enemies now working together to tend the wounded and rebuild what had been damaged. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of impossible thing that happened when people chose to see the best in each other instead of the worst. "That's very kind of you, Elder," Thomas said, his voice carrying the same quiet dignity it had held when facing down armed coalition soldiers. "But the truth is, you lot have been choosing all along. You just needed someone to remind you that choosing kindness was an option." As the sun set over Yorkshire, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and red, Thomas Hartwell's farm had become something unprecedented in galactic history. A place where former enemies had become allies, where fear had been replaced by understanding, and where the simple act of treating others with dignity had literally changed the course of interstellar civilization. But the real test was yet to come. News of the Yorkshire stand was spreading throughout the galaxy at light speed, carrying with it questions that would challenge the fundamental assumptions of every spacefaring species. If the Draconis could choose compassion over hunger, what other impossible changes were possible? If a simple farmer could accomplish what millennia of advanced science and military might had failed to achieve, what did that say about the nature of civilization itself? And most importantly, if kindness really was more powerful than fear, what kind of galaxy might be possible if more beings chose to embrace it? The universe was about to find out. 5 years after the Yorkshire stand, Thomas Hartwell sat on his porch with his morning tea and marveled at how much the galaxy had changed. His farm was still a working agricultural operation, though it had expanded considerably. The fields that had once held only sheep and cattle now accommodated a remarkable variety of beings, each contributing their unique abilities to what had become the most productive agricultural collective in human space. Vorthak used his precisely controlled flame to clear diseased plants without harming healthy ones. Thyra had designed beautiful living structures that served as both barns and art installations. The crystalline hive workers had created soil enhancement systems that had tripled crop yields while improving environmental sustainability. Most remarkably, none of it felt strange anymore. The sight of dragons working alongside humans, of aliens from dozens of species sharing meals and stories, had become simply normal. Children from a nearby village came by after school to help with chores and homework, treating their alien neighbors with the casual acceptance that Thomas had come to understand was humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy. The changes had spread far beyond his little farm. The Draconis refugees who had arrived after the battle had dispersed throughout human space and beyond, carrying with them the lesson they'd learned in Yorkshire, that they could choose who they wanted to be. Within 2 years, reports of Draconis attacks had dropped to zero, replaced by stories of dragons serving as healers, builders, artists, and protectors on hundreds of worlds. The effect on interstellar politics had been profound. The Galactic Council, once a loose alliance of species that barely tolerated each other, had transformed into a genuine cooperative body focused on mutual aid and understanding. The Kethmori had begun the painful process of reintegrating emotions into their society, with many of their younger generation choosing to undergo experimental procedures to reverse their species' genetic modifications. The Zalari had disbanded their neural suppression programs entirely, leading to a renaissance of art and culture that was spreading throughout their territories. Even the remnants of the Purifier Coalition had found a different path. Faced with overwhelming evidence that their fundamental assumptions about the nature of good and evil were wrong, many had chosen to dedicate themselves to understanding rather than destruction. Some had joined research expeditions aimed at finding other species that might benefit from the Yorkshire approach, as historians were calling it. But perhaps the most significant change was the simplest. Throughout the galaxy, beings were learning to be kind to each other. Thomas had watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and bemusement. Delegations from across the galaxy, regularly visited his farm to study the miracle that had occurred there, trying to understand the complex psychological and sociological factors that had enabled such unprecedented change. They wrote detailed analyses of human compassion, created elaborate theories about the neurological basis of empathy, and established entire academic departments dedicated to studying applied kindness theory. What none of them seemed to understand was that there was no complex theory, no elaborate psychological framework. There was only the simple recognition that suffering beings deserved help, regardless of who or what they were. Dr. Voss, who had become both a regular visitor and one of Thomas's closest friends, arrived that morning with news from the Galactic Council's latest session. "They've approved the proposal," she announced without preamble, settling into the chair beside him with obvious satisfaction. "Full species recognition for artificial intelligences, with all the rights and protections that entails." The vote was unanimous. Thomas raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Even the species that don't use AI?" "Especially them," Dr. Voss replied. After watching what happened with the Draconis, no one wanted to be responsible for creating another crisis through fear and prejudice. The debate wasn't whether AIs deserved rights, but how quickly those rights could be implemented. It was, Thomas reflected, typical of how the galaxy had changed. Where once the default response to difference had been suspicion and hostility, now it was curiosity and acceptance. Species that had warred for centuries were collaborating on research projects. Civilizations that had refused to communicate were sharing art and literature. The very concept of us versus them was becoming obsolete, replaced by a growing understanding that diversity was strength, not threat. The sound of children's laughter drew his attention to the field where a group of youngsters were playing with several young Draconis who had been hatched since the stand. The dragon children were barely larger than ponies, their scales still soft and changing color with their emotions. They were engaged in what appeared to be an elaborate game of tag that involved flying, breathing carefully controlled puffs of flame, and a great deal of giggling from all participants. "Corthin tells me the Draconis have decided to establish a permanent colony on Luna," Dr. Voss continued, following his gaze. "They want to create something they're calling a garden of memory, a living monument to the worlds that were lost during the Hunger Years, and a pledge that such destruction will never happen again." Thomas nodded approvingly. The elder dragon had become something of a galactic statesman, traveling from world to share the lessons learned in Yorkshire. His speeches about choosing hope over despair, creation over destruction, had become required viewing in schools throughout civilized space. "What about the research expedition to the Omega Sector?" Thomas asked. "Any word from them?" Dr. Voss's expression grew more serious. "They found what they were looking for. 3 species that match the pattern. Beings who've been classified as irredeemably hostile, but who show signs of higher intelligence and emotional complexity. The expedition leader thinks the Yorkshire approach might work with all of them." The Omega Sector expedition was one of several ongoing projects aimed at applying Thomas's methods to other impossible situations throughout the galaxy. Teams of diplomats, scientists, and volunteers, many of them former enemies who had learned to work together, were seeking out species and situations where kindness might succeed where force had failed. The success rate was remarkable. In the past 5 years, 17 different conflicts have been resolved through what was becoming known as compassionate first contact. Entire species have been brought back from the brink of extinction or madness through simple acknowledgement of their personhood and dignity. "There's something else," Dr. Voss said quietly. "The Council has been debating whether to make an official request." "What sort of request?" "They want to name you Ambassador Emeritus to the galactic community. The position would involve traveling to crisis situations throughout the galaxy, applying your approach to problems that conventional diplomacy can't solve." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer. The idea of leaving his farm, even for such an important purpose, felt wrong somehow. This place, these fields, this simple life, they were what had made the miracle possible in the first place. "I'm honored by the offer," he said finally, "but I think I'll stay put. The galaxy doesn't need me traveling around trying to fix things. It needs more people willing to see the person behind the problem, wherever they are." Dr. Voss smiled, clearly unsurprised by his response. "I thought you might say that." The council has an alternative proposal. They want to establish a formal academy here, on your farm. A place where beings from across the galaxy can come to learn not just the techniques of peaceful resolution, but the mindset that makes it possible. The idea had merit, Thomas admitted. Already, his farm served as an informal teaching center for visitors from across the galaxy. Formalizing the arrangement might allow them to help more people to spread the lessons of Yorkshire more effectively, as long as it doesn't interfere with the farming, he said with a slight smile. This is still a working operation, after all. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Vorthak, who landed nearby with the gentle precision he developed over years of practice. The dragon had grown stronger and more confident since his arrival, but he still made a point of checking in with Thomas every morning. The delegation from the Spiral Alliance has arrived, Vorthak reported. They're requesting guidance on integrating a recently discovered species into galactic society. Apparently, the newcomers have abilities that some council members find concerning. Thomas sighed. Even after 5 years of demonstrated success, there were still those who defaulted to fear when faced with difference. It was, he supposed, an eternal aspect of sapient nature that would require constant vigilance to overcome. What sort of abilities, he asked. Telepathic projection on a planetary scale, Dr. Voss replied, having clearly been briefed on the situation. They can share thoughts and emotions with every living being on their world simultaneously. Some council members are worried about the security implications. Thomas thought about that for a moment. A species with that kind of power could indeed be dangerous if they chose to use their abilities for harmful purposes. But then, so could any species with advanced technology or powerful weapons, or even just large populations and hostile intentions. Are they asking for help, or are we imposing ourselves on them? He asked. They've specifically requested contact with the humans who taught the dragons to choose love over hunger, Vorthak replied. According to their message, they've been watching galactic affairs since the Yorkshire stand and want to learn how to join the community without being feared or persecuted. That, Thomas reflected, was exactly the right attitude. These newcomers understood that power came with responsibility, and they wanted guidance on how to use their gifts constructively rather than destructively. Well then, he said, rising from his chair with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned that small actions could have enormous consequences. I suppose we'd better go meet them properly. As the three of them walked toward the latest group of visitors, Thomas felt the familiar sense of possibility that had become his constant companion since that morning 5 years ago when he'd found a broken dragon in his pasture. Every new species, every first contact, every moment of potential fear or hatred offered the same choice. See the monster or see the person. The galaxy, it seemed, was finally learning to consistently choose the person. Behind them, in the fields of Yorkshire, children of a dozen different species continued their game, their laughter carrying on the wind like a promise of the future. A future where difference was celebrated rather than feared, where problems were solved through understanding rather than force, with a simple recognition of shared personhood could transform even the most bitter enemies into friends. It was, Thomas thought with quiet satisfaction, a future worth believing in. And it had all started with an old farmer who understood that when someone was hungry and hurting, you helped them. Not because it was strategically wise or politically advantageous, or even because you expected gratitude in return. You helped because that's what decent people did. The galaxy had learned that lesson well, and it was all the better for it. As they reached the gathering of newcomers, beings of crystalline structure and flowing energy who pulsed with gentle light, Thomas extended his hand in the universal gesture of greeting that had become standard throughout galactic space. Welcome, he said simply. You've come a long way. Let's get you settled and see how we can help. And in that moment, as hands and energy tendrils and various other appendages reached out to meet his, Thomas Hartwell knew that the work of building a kinder universe would continue long after he was gone. Not because of any grand plan or cosmic destiny, but because once people learned to see each other as people, that vision became self-sustaining. The universe was vast and full of wonders, but the greatest wonder of all was this: the simple recognition that everyone, no matter how strange or powerful or different, was someone worthy of kindness. It was a lesson the galaxy would never forget.